i allra högsta grad de mänskliga rättigheterna. Vi ska nu gå vidare till en programpunkt som Svenska kyrkans internationella arbete håller i. Det är Sofia Nordenmark som är policyrådgivare med fokus på Latinamerika som ska föra ett samtal med Louise Winstanley om Röster från civilsamhället, vägar för fred i Colombia. De senaste åren har vi ju hört väldigt mycket om utvecklingen och fredsarbetet i Colombia, och det ska bli otroligt intressant att höra vad de senaste rönen om hur situationen ser ut nu. This conversation will be held in English, and I'll please welcome Sofia and Louise and enjoy the talk.
Hi, welcome to this really short seminar. It's going to be a big challenge to tell you what the situation is for civil society organizations and human rights defenders in Colombia in 20 minutes, and to share some of all the exciting experiences on how they tackle their security situation, and that it's very dangerous to work with human rights in Colombia. We have invited Louise Winstanley from AB Colombia. She's a program and advocacy manager for AB Colombia. Could you please tell us what is AB Colombia?
Basically, AB Colombia is the advocacy platform of 5 major development agencies, all with programs in Colombia. And we do the advocacy work in the UK, in Ireland, the EU, and at UN level.
And you have recently published a report, Civil Society Voices, Agendas for Peace in Colombia. So this is what we'll talk about during this seminar. Can you tell us something about the background situation in Colombia? It's a country in armed conflict. Could you tell us something about this?
Yes, well, Colombia's had a long-term internal conflict going on for the last 50 years. But the really sad part about this conflict is that it's really the civil population that's borne the brunt of it. They've suffered huge numbers of disappearances, way above that of Argentina. 30,000 people have been disappeared. 3 million people internally displaced. 6 million people internally displaced. It's the second largest number of people after Syria. They've had land grabbed of around 6.5 million hectares. And behind the conflict and driving this displacement has been not only for military and strategic purposes, but also economic interests. There's various actors in the conflict, the paramilitaries, that have particularly perpetrated the crimes against the civilian population and human rights defenders. They had a demobilization process in 2005, but the middle-ranking sectors didn't demobilize, and they've reformed, and they now continue and are called post-demobilization paramilitary groups. When they demobilized, they numbered about 30,000, but today they're around 10,000. The FARC and the ELN are 2 of the largest guerrilla groups, and the FARC is currently engaged in peace dialogues with the government. And the security forces have acted throughout the conflict, either in collusion or jointly with paramilitary groups.
What is happening right now in the peace conversations that are going on in Colombia?
Well, in the end of 2012, peace talks started with the largest of the guerrilla group, the FARC. They declared a bilateral ceasefire, but the ELN continue in the conflict. They're a much smaller group, but they're discussing an agenda for peace talks with the government currently. It's been noticeable that the FARC has actually apologized at the moment for some of the crimes that it's committed, and also the Santos government, particularly to the peace communities, have made public apologies for the actions of the security forces. The peace process itself has been quite astonishing in a way, because victims and civil society organizations, human rights defenders, were very stigmatized by the government throughout the whole of this conflict. But the peace process has begun to open up new areas of participation for them and for civil society organizations and victims organizations in Colombia. And over 60 victims were invited to go and speak to the peace at the peace talks to both sides with their proposals for what would make for a sustainable peace. Really, the FARC at the moment and the government are at the last stages of the discussions, and it's hoped that by December of this year they will bring out peace agreements. Things are really moving at the moment. They've started to talk. The last stages are really involved in talking about transitional justice, and this has been a very thorny issue, particularly given the levels of conflict-related sexual violence in the Colombian conflict, which neither side has wanted to admit to. But they're just talking about now the disarmament phase and transitional justice. And it's noticeable that the government forces and the FARC have come together. Their ideas are much closer aligned since they started the peace talks, in the sense that neither want to pay for the crimes that they've committed. And it's really been the civilian population and civil society groups that have had to stand up for the right to truth, and that there should be the most responsible, at least, should be prosecuted.
So there seem to be a lot of positive steps taken in Colombia. And that there may be a peace agreement before this year has come to an end between FARC and the current government. Does this mean that it's much easier now to be a human rights defender or to work within a civil society organization in Colombia?
Unfortunately, that's not been the case. The numbers of killings of human rights defenders and community leaders has really increased since the beginning of the peace talks. And in part, that goes back to what I originally said about economic interest being a driving force behind the conflict. Many of the civil society organizations and victims groups are working on land restitution issues. The government passed, not long after it came into office, a law giving the right to the victims to have their land restored. But as they've tried to access this law and find a way to have their land restituted to them, there's been far more killings. And at the moment, one human rights defender is being killed every 5 days. It's a huge number. That's in the first 6 months of this year. On average, that's what's been the case.
So the situation is quite difficult right now, both for civil society organizations and human rights defenders. What do you human rights defenders and civil society organizations do to cope? And do they have any protection mechanisms?
Well, I think the defenders in Colombia have been quite sophisticated in the ways in which they developed their models of protection. They've always worked with the international community in order to help increase the protection for them, and particularly for very high-profile human rights defenders. So, for example, there's been groups like Sofia from Sweden, and Peace Brigades International also, which has a group here, and they've physically put volunteers into Colombia to accompany human rights defenders as they go about their work. And this has been quite an amazing protection of the space that individual human rights defenders have had. But defenders have also used other international mechanisms. For example, they've set up communities that have gone back partially to their territory, and they've demarked them, saying that this is an area just for the civilian population and no armed actors are allowed in. And then they've got special protection measures from the Inter-American Court, which means that whenever an incident happened to these communities, the Colombian government had to answer to the court as to what it was doing to protect the communities. And this has been a really interesting mechanism to protect communities as a whole, especially those living in rural areas. So their strategies have always involved international support, and even in terms of dialogue. The UN has often been present at dialogues between human rights organizations and the government because of the level of stigmatization that they experienced from past governments.
Church of Sweden works with enabling environment for civil society in all the countries where we are present. If we look at Colombia, Do you see that civil society has had a role when it comes to the peace process? Do they have a role for the future? And what has that been?
Well, yes, very much so. The civil society groups have very much engaged with the peace process. I have to say that some groups in civil society are very cautious about the peace process because of their past experiences. Others have fully engaged. And there are groups, particularly those that supported the last president, who are very much against the peace process and think that you should militarily finish with the FARC. So there are those three differing views, but overall, those who've really got behind the peace process have contributed a lot. As I said, there were 60 victims that went to the peace talks, but also civil society organizations have organized things like a summit, for example, in Bogota, where 400 women came together and they put pressure on the government and insisted that there should be women at the peace table, on the front row of the peace table in the negotiations. And after a year of pressurizing, this summit finally achieved that. And it was very important for them because of the high levels of conflict-related sexual violence that's been used and the fact that they wanted to put this on the agenda at Havana.
So you have already mentioned some groups of human rights defenders and civil society organizations that work with special issues. But what do you see, who are the most exposed, who meet the most difficult situation at this point in Colombia when they work with human rights?
Okay, so those who are confronting the most difficult situations are groups like indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant communities who live on collectively owned territory in rural areas. Women, quite clearly, they've been one of the major victims of the conflict. They're the ones who want land restitution. They're the ones that have suffered sexual violence and forced displacement overwhelmingly, and also small-scale farmers. And it's been very interesting, the strategies that both these groups and civil society organizations have used in order to educate the rest of the population, often in the urban areas, about what are happening in the rural areas. So all the way through the conflict, no matter what the dangers to the human rights defenders, they would walk to many of these communities in rural areas in order to document the cases, denounce the cases, and try to force the justice system to actually work to tackle the issues of impunity. And I would say that's one of the largest or the most serious dangers, really, for human rights defenders, for attacks against communities, etc., is the high levels of impunity in Colombia.
We talked a bit about the situation for women human rights defenders and those who work with women's human rights. What has their situation been?
Okay, for women human rights defenders, there's also been additional attacks and additional situations they've had to confront. It's been very noticeable that the attacks on women human rights defenders are not just on them, it's actually on their families too. So, for example, one woman human rights defender who's the leader of a community, she had to, for her security, for a while, to go for 6 months into exile, but she went back quite recently. And she immediately began to be followed. But the attack wasn't against her. They beat up her son as a warning. So for many women human rights defenders, the emotional issues that arise because of the threats against their family are quite noticeable. One lawyer had a small box sent to her with a little doll in it, and they put a red cross on it, and they said, "Take care of your daughter." So the threats are obvious, and these are very difficult for women human rights defenders to deal with. And they very often say to me, it's one thing to deal with the threats when they're against me, another when they're against my family. The additional problem for women human rights defenders is very often those who've been documenting cases of conflict-related sexual violence have also been raped themselves as a warning to them to stop doing this. So in that way, that kind of violence is also used against them. And finally, there's really poor protection mechanisms that the government offers for women human rights defenders. they're often the heads of households, or they're required to move. If they have to move, they're required to move with their families. But as far as the government's concerned, they will only support the woman human rights defender to move. It's very male-orientated, these protection measures. They won't support the whole family to move, and they won't support getting the children into education if they do move. So there's some major issues for women defenders to actually try to defend themselves.
The current government in Sweden has declared that our foreign policy is a feminist foreign policy. Can you see that Sweden could have a role in Colombia in supporting women human rights defenders and civil society organizations that work with women's rights?
Yes, I think this is going to be very important, especially in the future, because as I said, that organizations there have always managed to keep the space open for them to be able to work and to participate at very high levels often, because of the accompaniment they have from international organizations, NGOs, political support from governments and embassies in Colombia. This has been absolutely crucial, really. And I think that in terms of women human rights defenders, we have to look at how we target in the future that funding and political support are given to local organizations, because that's really where people are going to lose out. As governments look at the peace process, a lot of the funding is moving over to the government for the whole disarmament process, reintegration, etc. And whilst that's really very good and very positive, if we don't actually fund organizations on the ground, then we're going to have a problem. And so a government's going to have a problem, because these policies need to be monitored on the ground. And the only people able to monitor the implementation of policies on the ground are civil society organizations, NGOs. So they're going to be absolutely crucial. And I think we can't afford to lose them. My other concern is that as we come to the point of signing peace accords, given that the conflict isn't over in Colombia, not all of the groups are involved in these peace agreements. It's the FARC and the government, not the paramilitary groups who've been most responsible for crimes against civil society, and not some of the other guerrilla groups. Normally when you see peace accords signed, very often there's a spike in violence, and that's certainly what we expect to see. So it's going to be absolutely crucial that governments are looking to fund local organizations, looking to monitor what's going on the ground, and giving political support to NGOs.
So you're saying that the peace in Colombia has to be built locally, and that Sweden should support such a local peace process?
I think that, yes, I think that's going to be absolutely crucial for the sustainability. Because in no small part, the level of corruption at the local level is really problematic. And if you're wanting to build a peace process, it has to start from the grassroots. And that involves NGOs taking their experience of reconciliation programs. I've seen some of them beginning to work in Colombia at the very grassroots, but that's what's going to be really necessary. They're going to have to monitor what's happening within the local governance structures as well, and they're going to have to be insisting on development policies that are going to support the victims, because many of these are small-scale farmers, and there's some real worries amongst the victims groups that the policies that have been promoted by the government are all about large-scale natural resource extraction. The kind of liberalization policies will impact on agriculture, and there's no policies that the government appears to be developing that actually will help support small-scale and medium-scale farmers as these victims seek to return. So all of this, it needs to be monitored, needs to be fed into development plans, and local government structures really are going to have to work. So, yes.
So there are also many economic interests at this point to develop more commercially in Colombia. Do you have any recommendations to the Swedish government regarding this? Because they have already signaled that the commercial relations between Sweden and Colombia will be more and more important as a peace agreement has been signed.
Yes, well, there's some really key issues. Land, as I said at the beginning, has been a crucial issue. And as we see businesses move in, very often they're moving into areas where people have been forcibly displaced, where there's been human rights violations. And what we're seeing is that the land restitution program is going along very slowly, but things like mining concessions are being rolled out at the most amazing rates. So what we're finding is that communities, for example, I work with one indigenous community in the Choco region, which is a very biodiverse region of the country, and they were trying to move back to their resguardo, to their collectively owned territory, and they found that 82% of their territory being concessioned to mining corporations. Neighbouring them is an Afro-descendant community, and they found that over 55% of their community territory had been given to mining corporations. So I think companies and investments in terms of land, whether it's agro-industrial projects or natural resource extraction, etc., they're going to really have to pay attention to due diligence. There's going to have to be good advice from governments as to what's happening. And the main tool, I think, for really trying to protect the rights of these communities will be to ensure that they carry out a proper, free, prior and informed consent process with the communities in those regions. And it's important also that I've found with the UK, and I hope it doesn't also happen in Sweden, but the UK brought in a bilateral investment treaty, which actually protects the rights of these companies that have the concession, even if they haven't mined it. And what we mean is that the Colombian government would have to pay 30 years of what that company would have earned if they'd been allowed to go ahead with the concession. So as you could say, internationally, we could play in a very negative way into the situation and further violate the rights of victims.
Thank you, Louise. Now we have to give space to the next seminar that will take place here. But we will go to the stand of Church of Sweden, and you are welcome to come there. We have copies of the report if you want to have a copy, and you can also continue discussing with us.